So this question is about sustainable versus non-sustainable fishing practices between 1974 and 2010. Now we are given a graph to use and we are expected to use the labels on the graph and the data as well in our answers. And anytime we get a graph, the first thing I would probably do is to look at the key that's been given at the bottom. So the key says that the light blue data is fishing at biologically unsustainable levels. So we can see at the top it says overfished, the percentage of the stocks that have been assessed. And then the darker blue data is fishing where fish have been caught from the sea that's biologically sustainable. So if we have sustainable fishing, it really means that the breeding populations, when they breed, they replenish the population of fish over time. So it's not over time going so low that we're endangering that species, the risk of becoming extinct. Now, if we just annotate the data to start with, we're going to look at the overfished percentage of stocks. So in 1974 on the left, that was about 12% of the stocks that were assessed that were overfished. That's not sustainable. And because we're going to use the data, we can see at 2010 that actually that value, that percentage, has increased from 12% to around about 29%. Okay, just using the data off the y-axis. Now, if we look at the biologically sustainable levels, and within that group, we're looking at fully fished populations, where it is still sustainable, but we've reached the maximum level that we can fully fish to keep it sustainable. That's actually also increased. So if you use the data off the y-axis on the left, we can see there is a higher percentage given on the y-axis on the right-hand side where it says 2010. Now, if we have a look at the biologically sustainable levels that were underfished, so we used to have a bigger percentage of the world stocks which were underfished. That means fish were caught probably in these regions, but really sustainable. Lots of breeding fish could still replenish the population. So these populations have actually declined. So there's smaller numbers of underfished populations of fish. Now, if you just have a look at some of the data since 2007, hopefully you can see that that darker blue data, it does remain fairly constant since 2007 up to 2010, and we're not actually given any data after 2010 here. So the lines do go up and down, but when you get to 2007 off the x-axis, there is some plateauing of the percentage of stocks which are overfished. So now that we've annotated the data, we can use this in our answer to draw some conclusions about the world fishing stocks and how they've changed since 1974. So the first point is just making those ideas about the data and how it varies over time. So the overfished percentage of stocks has increased, and you can use the data to represent that. And the fully fished sustainable fishing stocks have increased as well, but there's actually been a decrease in the underfished percentage of stocks, which has gone down. So if you have a look at actually point number 6, any reference to data off the graph to support these statements will be actually 2 marks out of 4. Now the second mark point then states any fish stocks which are going down could be a problem because it could put some of these species of fish at risk of becoming extinct. So they might start to become endangered, where they've got a risk of becoming extinct and disappearing. Mark point number 3, the unsustainable fishing, which was the light blue data, has increased, and there's actually been a fall collectively, a decrease in sustainable fishing, where breeding populations would actually be maintained across the course of a year. Since 2007, so this is mark point number 4, the biologically sustainable fishing have stayed constant, which also means that the overfished stocks of fish have also remained constant. And that might be certain policies have been brought in, such as legislation to only fish in certain areas of the seas. Mesh sizes might have been made a bit bigger, for example, to let the bigger fish escape, which maintain breeding populations. So mark point number 5 then is within the sustainable fishing, which was the dark blue data, there's more maximally or fully fished stocks, and fewer of the stocks are underfished. So that's looking at the blue data to show that the maximally fished stocks have increased, and there's fewer underfished stocks. And as I said, any correct use of data to pick up one of the mark points. So part B says to describe 3 different strategies, not referring to aquaculture, which can be used to prevent overfishing, and then explain how each would then help to conserve the stocks. So we're going to go for 3 separate ideas to prevent overfishing, but we then need to explain each one to make sure we pick up that mark point. So without explaining the statement you make, it's not going to give you the mark point that you should be able to get. So the first one could be to have a certain mesh size on the nets which are used for the fishing. So the explanation for that might be that it would allow younger fish to escape or slightly smaller fish to escape, which could then go on to help to maintain the breeding populations in the wild. We could have either exclusion zones where fishermen are not allowed to actually fish in that area of the sea, or we could have seasonal restrictions where they're not allowed to fish at a certain time of the year. And the explain bit would be so that the fishermen don't catch the breeding fish, the juveniles, and therefore the stocks can be replenished or the stocks can be recovered to maintain the population numbers. Okay, the third one was about quotas. So this could be due for things like the mass of the fish which are caught, and if they go over a certain weight or mass of fish that are caught, they put some of the fish back into the seas. It could be about the number of fishing boats which are allowed in a fishing fleet at any one time. Could be reduced, therefore this would also result in less fish actually being caught. So question C then is actually going to talk about fish farming as opposed to the fishing of wild fish in the seas. So we call that aquaculture. Now the Scottish salmon industry is one such example of farmed fish. One problem with raising salmon this way is that there can often be a high buildup of parasites such as lice. And the lice then feed on the blood and the tissue of the salmon, which can cause obviously damage to the salmon. So the question says, why are the farmed fish more susceptible to infection by lice than wild fish? And why is eliminating the lice a problem for fish farms? So we can see it's a 2-marker. So obviously these are the two parts of the question we need to reference. So why are the farmed fish more susceptible to infection by lice? And lice is the parasite. Well, farmed fish are going to be in a really high density within a certain volume of water, whereas obviously out in the wild that they're not quite as densely packed together. So this is about the spread of the parasite between individuals when they're in a very high density. And why is eliminating the lice a problem? Well, fish farmers will very often use pesticides to target the lice, which are the parasites or the pests. And one issue with that is that some of the lice might become resistant to the effect of pesticides, and therefore they become ineffective against them. So the answer is then mark point 1, the farmed fish, the aquaculture are more closely packed together. So therefore the lice or the parasites can more easily be spread from fish to fish. Please don't use the word disease. Okay, it's the parasite that causes potential disease, but it's the spread or the transmission of the parasite that's important. And the parasites or the lice cannot be easily killed, as they may have become resistant to the effect of the pesticides that are used by the farmers. Now, the next question is talking about the importance of environmental concerns that farmed fish can escape from the pens and maybe go into the wild populations of fish and start to breed with some of those, or they might spread the parasites like the lice to the wild fish. So explain 3 reasons why it's important to the environment that the escape of farmed fish must be prevented from the pen in which they're grown. So in terms of the mark scheme, then it's really some idea that the farmed fish could be considered to be an invasive species if they escaped the pen. They might decrease biodiversity. Okay, they might reduce the numbers of wild fish in the wild fish populations, because they might be able to compete for things like eating smaller fish, which might be obviously the food. They might start to breed with some of the wild fish. They might compete, so it might be inter-specific competition, for example, for habitats with the wild fish, and therefore it could have a negative impact on food chains. The third mark point was if the farmed fish escape the pen and they've got parasites, the parasites might be transmitted into the wild fish, causing a spread of disease. And the last one was if the wild fish could interbreed with the farmed fish, if they were of the same species, it might reduce the genetic diversity of the wild fish, might dilute the gene pool, and it might threaten the long-term survival of that particular species of wild fish, which could endanger that species, and ultimately it might cause it to go extinct over time. Now, the next question is about planetary boundaries, and we know the definition for planetary boundaries is that it's some sort of global process affected by humans, within which there's a safe operating space for that global process, such as the use of fertilizers in farming, the production of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, etc. Now, if that planetary boundary is exceeded, then very often there's irreversible damage caused to habitats within that particular ecosystem. So one boundary that has been crossed is the biodiversity boundary, which they measure as the number of species becoming extinct per million species over time. Now, the normal level for that boundary is 10 species per million species per year, but the current loss is over 100 species per year, so it's tenfold higher than the actual safe operating space of the planetary boundary. So in Peru, we know Peru is near the equator, there's rainforests in that tropical ecosystem. There's a new technique called strip felling, and this involves harvesting the trees in an area 50 meters wide, but the area surrounding the cut down area or the deforested area is actually left intact. So that's a sustainable alternative to just felling the trees, deforestation on a massive scale. Now, the photograph below shows an area of strip felling 5 years after harvesting. So harvesting is where the felled trees are collected, and for example, the wood is collected and transported away from that area. And you can see there is new regrowth of different species of plants within the felled area. So the question says, explain why this method of tree harvesting is helping to reduce the extinction rate, whereas mass felling of trees is not. So what are the benefits of doing this strip felling technique? So because you've still got lots of different species of trees surrounding the felled area, there's going to be quite extensive roots in the soil. And we know roots stabilize the soil and they prevent soil erosion if there's heavy rainfall. So that's one advantage. The second advantage is that light can actually reach the ground level to stimulate growth of maybe smaller plants on the forest floor. So you could kind of see that in the photograph somewhat. Seeds from the neighbouring uncut or unfelled areas might fall down onto the ground where they can then get oxygen and water in the right temperatures, and they can start to germinate. So that's going to allow succession to then take place in that felled area. Now, because there is a soil already, and because the seeds from the surrounding trees can still fall to the ground into the soil, that's going to be secondary succession. There's no bare rock face here. There still would be pioneer species, which are obviously the trees that surround the felled area. Now, because there's a high biodiversity and new plants can grow fairly quickly, lots of different habitats can still be maintained. So please don't forget, plants do provide habitats for other animals like insects and pollinating insects, and then maybe slightly bigger animals like birds, and then more mammals. So because more habitats may be maintained, there might be more ecological niches that are available, which is the role of the different species within that community, which is point E. Now, because obviously there are some trees around the felled area, the leaves of these trees that are dead and fall to the ground can still be decomposed. So we've done the nitrogen cycle, and we know the protein and the DNA and the RNA, the nitrogen in those molecules can be converted into ammonium ions by ammonification. So they would be bacteria and fungi in the soil, the saprobionts, which decompose the dead leaves. So the soil is going to be fairly fertile with lots of ammonium ions in it and nitrite ions, and therefore hopefully nitrate ions. And point G then is the soil is not as wet as in mass felling, because obviously the roots of the existing trees can still absorb the water by osmosis down a water potential gradient into the roots. And therefore, because it's not waterlogged, there's more oxygen in the soil. It's aerated because the air can get in between the soil particles as opposed to the water, the excessive water. And please don't forget that plant roots do require oxygen to respire aerobically to make ATP, to then absorb nitrate ions and phosphate ions, etc. And also, if they're not waterlogged soil, there's going to be less denitrification because Pseudomonas prefer anaerobic conditions. And also, you do get more nitrification in the soil because we know nitrifying bacteria are obligate aerobes. Now, they did say accept the reverse argument for all of these points, but this is where you make a really nice model answer based on this mark scheme. Now, question 15 here says the loss of the suitable habitat by destruction or degradation or fragmentation is the most important cause of species becoming endangered, which is where they're at risk of becoming extinct. Now, the question says distinguish between the terms endangered and extinct. So distinguish means basically what is the difference. So you might want to use the term whereas to talk about differences. So endangered is where a species is probably present in fairly small population numbers, and it's in danger or at risk of becoming extinct or dying out. Whereas the word extinct means there's no more individuals of that species alive. They cannot be identified, they cannot be found, so the species has completely died out with none remaining. The second part of the question is saying, apart from habitat loss, what are two other causes of species extinction? So this is in the class booklet, and you've got a whole list of different ideas, from ideas like pollution or build-up of pollution to overhunting or overfishing. It could be the introduction of a non-native species or alien species which might outcompete the native species for nesting sites, breeding sites, food. It could be competition from domestic animals, or it even could be things like global warming and climate change due to the buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere like methane and carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide. So part B to this question is talking about a forest fire, and following that forest fire, given time, that the forest would be able to regenerate itself into a state very similar to the community that existed before the forest fire. So it says, give the full name of the biological process involved in the forest regeneration. Now, obviously, there is existing soil. So once the forest fire has been put out or finished, the existing soil would have spores or seeds within it, which can then germinate, and they would be the pioneer species. So this is not bare rock, and the process is therefore called secondary succession. So it's not colonization of bare rock, but it's colonization of an area that was once previously colonized. Now, using relevant technical terms, it says describe and explain the process of the forest regeneration. So it says, please describe the process and explain it of secondary succession in a forest. So we know that there are spores present in the soil and seeds. If the conditions are correct, once the forest fire doesn't exist anymore, so oxygen, the correct temperature, and imbibition of water into the seeds, you get seed germination. The plants that emerge or grow are called the pioneer species, so they'll be the first to colonize the area. Now, the pioneer species, they can change some abiotic factors normally, especially if they're plants within that given area. For example, the pioneer species might grow, some of them die, they get decomposed. The protein, the DNA, is ammonified, so it's put back into the soil, the nitrogen, as ammonium ions, which are converted to nitrites and nitrates. So it's making the soil more fertile. So we then get a second species, this is the important point, that is going to outcompete the pioneer species very often. So it says that allows other species to colonize or grow within that area. That's marked point C. Now, as this second species colonizes and increases in population numbers, okay, it might start to provide more habitats for insects. For example, if these plants produce flowers, we might get some pollinating insects. Those species come in and they've got that particular role within that ecosystem. So we're going to get a more complex community of different species, and this change in the composition of the community is called a seer. Okay, so it's the sequential progression of different species and the composition of different species, okay, over time. That's marked point D. And lastly, we'll get hopefully to a climax community, and it does say explain it please. So that means that the climax community remains fairly stable over time. So the number of different species and the type of different species remains fairly constant in equilibrium, and it's always the final stage of, in this case, secondary succession. Okay, so part D then is talking about forest fragmentation. So it says fragmentation exposes species to potentially harmful environmental effects, and it tends to be the species which are located on the edge of the forest fragment. So if we have a look at the picture, the diagram, we can see that each fragment is a different area, different size, and we're looking at the outside white strip. So any species there, for example, in the forest, might be more exposed to sunlight. They might be more exposed to reduced humidity in the air. They might be more exposed to higher wind speeds, or maybe more visible to predators, for example, if they're animals. Now, the question is going to ask us to work out the percentage of the fragment area that's influenced by the edge effects. So it wants the white strip that surrounds the green square as a percentage of the total area of the fragment. So if we start with the one in the middle, hopefully you guys can see that the height is 300 meters and the width is also 300 meters. So that would be 300 squared, and that would give us the total area of the fragment. So I'm just going to put total area. But we know that the strip is 35 meters wide. So the actual height of the green square is 300 minus the two lots of 35. So that would be 230 meters. and then obviously we want the area of the green square, so it's 230 meters squared. Okay. Now, if we find the total area at the top and subtract 230 squared, we actually get the area of the white strip. And we can take that area of the white strip and divide by the original total area, which is 300 squared, to get the percentage if we just times it by 100. So if we look at the answers on the bottom right, we can see 300 squared minus 230 squared will give you the area of the white strip where the edge effect can be seen. Divide that by the total area of the square, which is 300 squared, times 100, and you'll get 41.2%. And if you're not sure, you could use the other diagrams, so the bigger square on the left or the two smaller squares on the right, to check the working out, because you're given the percentages there just to check against. So the last part of the question is asking us to describe the trend that we can see in the data, so using the values, and also suggest two different abiotic, and that means non-living factors that would differ in the edges of the fragmented forests. So the first one then is describe the trend in the data. So the smaller the patch or the fragment, the greater the percentage of the area on the outside influenced by the edge effect. And two different abiotic factors that could affect the species present could be, especially if they're plant species, the light intensity might be higher because light can actually get to more of the plants. If, for example, the edge of the fragment is next to cropland, then more light might be able to get to the leaves of the plants on the edge of the fragment. Temperature could also increase. If there's greater light intensity, there might be higher temperatures. Humidity would likely be lower because maybe there's less dense plants on the edge, and we know plants release water vapor through transpiration, but they might be exposed to greater wind speed on the edge of the forest fragment.